Douglas, what is the aim of this exhibition? What do you want to show?
It's really an exhibition that shows the full career of Thomas Desmonts, but broken down. It is not a chronological exhibition. It's an exhibition that shows the power of images and the power of images in our culture through Desmonts' technique of finding a source image, recreating it with paper in his studio in a one-to-one scale, and rephotographing it and launching that image back into the world, usually in the form of a scale of more of a history painting, a large kind of format. So mostly what I like to think about in terms of the title, The Stutter of History, for this exhibition is that Desmonts' work has this uncanny effect of recreating the world from a photograph, but out of paper, in a way that, in fact, as you approach the image, it becomes clear that something is not quite right. There's a gap between the representation and what you're looking at and the world you inhabit as a visitor, as a viewer. And that's the kind of friction, the stutter. This in English we say stutter when someone trips over a word. And it's that stutter photographically between the world, between the image and the recreation of the image back in the world, sent back into the world. So this idea of history, which is so important, I think, in Desmonts' work, it's often a history that has significant events in it that are represented in his images. However, these are usually they're not able to be identified necessarily without more information. One of the earliest works in the exhibition is a photograph of the archive of the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl when she was saving all of her works because they wouldn't be exhibited anymore. But they're just blank boxes, film boxes on this big wall, as opposed to another sort of historical photograph of a room that has been kind of ransacked and paper strewn everywhere, which were the offices of the Stasi, the East German secret police, right when the wall came down in Berlin in '89, and people went through and ransacked the secret police files and threw them all over everywhere. So there's this kind of strain of, throughout his work, of looking at not just German history, but looking at history in general. So the most recent body of work in the exhibition is the series Refuge, which is devoted to 5 or 6 images of the hotel room, a very kind of corporate-looking hotel room, airport hotel room, that Edward Snowden, the American national security worker who basically, gave the information about what had been the spying that had been done by the NSA, by the US government, by the CIA, and data collecting, and kind of broke that story and is now a man without a land, although now I believe he's given Russian permanent residency, but he was stuck in a hotel room in the airport in Moscow for weeks before he knew where he could go, because he couldn't return to the US. So that body of work reimagines the hotel room, which looks somewhat cell-like in its kind of representation, and deals with the question of the information and the politics of information and whatnot. So all of the work, some of it's a little more personal, some of it deals with the question of the artist studio. Atelier, the work Atelier, is a recreation of Matisse's studio when he was cutting paper. So there's paper strewn all over the floor, bits and pieces of the leftovers from his cutouts that he would arrange as a submerge.
And which has a link with the process of...
Exactly. Thomas is, the world, in a way, is made of paper. Paper is an incredibly important, it's an incredibly important thing in our culture. We write on paper, photographs are produced on paper, magazines, journals, whatever. Paper is incredibly important. And this idea of making the model, which is so crucial to Desmonts' work, because he studied as a sculptor, not as a photographer.
But his use of photography is conceptual, right?
Absolutely, but it's also incredibly aesthetic at the same time.
And also there's a craftsman dimension in it.
Yes. In the photography itself, I mean,
Who cuts the paper?
who cuts the paper
Yeah.
in the studio?
Yes.
He has many assistants, but I think he does some of it, and his assistants.
How
do
many
some.
assistants?
I don't know.
Like many?
I know he has a core group of a couple of people, and maybe when I'm not sure, you would have to ask him. Probably for bigger projects, he has more people, but
But there's a dimension about the hand working.
yeah, the hand. There is a handmade quality to it because it's all handmade. So if you look at Duchamp's idea of the ready-made, it's not a ready-made. It's a handmade ready-made in the sense that he's recreating something in the world, trying to do it as close to possible.
But Duchamp.
But not a trompe-l'oeil. It's not trying to like make it really exact.
But it's almost trompe-l'oeil.
Almost. But I think the friction, the stutter in the work, is when you approach it and you realize something. You start to see the paper, but it's only when you look really carefully at the work. From far away, it looks like an atelier with a parquet floor. It looks like the hotel room. It looks like this. But when you really approach, you start to see the objects are somewhat made anonymous by the paper because there's no text. There's only text or typography in maybe one or two works in his entire career. One of them is called Podium, and it has numbers on it because he recreated a photograph of where Milosevic gave a very incendiary early pro-Serbian nationalist speech that was a precursor to the war.
But it's
war in
not
Bosnia.
here, right?
It is here.
It's here?
Yeah, it's upstairs. I don't know if you made it upstairs. It says 1989, 1389. So
okay.
it's invoking this.
So if we examine the different layers of the work,
Yes.
there's a craft dimension.
Absolutely.
There's a conceptual dimension
Yep.
about using photography.
Yeah.
And probably he's God because he's recreating the story, a new God.
Yeah. The god of paper, I don't know. I'm not sure how he would respond to that, but
Unluckily he can't respond. He doesn't want to speak.
I think though for looking at Thomas's work, for me, one thinks about also the way in which other artists as precursors have used images from the media. And someone like Andy Warhol with his disaster series, whether it's the car crashes or the electric chair, there is a sense of the idea of repetition in Damon's work. You only see it repeated once. He's repeating it in paper. And Warhol would repeat the same image over and over and over again on one canvas. But there is definitely Warhol would be an important precursor also in the way in which Warhol looked not only at stars, at famous people, Marilyn, Elvis, Liz Taylor.
But why do you compare it to?
To Desmond? I think it's crucially has the same DNA. It comes out of this culture of post-war international culture of the circulation of images, and that images are a new kind of landscape. And I think that rather than thinking about the real and the image as two separate things, as someone like Jean Baudrillard talked about the simulacra, there is this kind of sense of the materiality of images and their efficacy in the world. And I think that Thomas...
But one wanted to be a machine, the other one is exactly the contrary of a machine.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
No, for sure. The silkscreen, although there's a big argument to make about the way in which Warhol said he wanted to be a machine and yet longed to be a painter like abstract expressionist. So even with the silkscreen, there were differences. Each image on the Marilyn, there's a different rhythm, there's a different saturation.
That was making the price too.
Sorry?
The price was made by the differences.
Yeah, but I think we're talking not about market, but about the conceptual quality.
No, but the market is really part of Warhol's strategy, which is not at all about demand, as I know.
No. I'm not comparing him to him in that way. There were many, as a Warhol scholar, there were many ways of talking about Warhol, many ways of approaching it, but when one looks at the actual work, the idea of the handmade, ready-made is kind of present there in its own way as well, with different moments of drips and this and that in the silkscreen.
So you really think demand is an heir of Warhol?
I think they share a DNA. I don't think he's the heir. He's not the inheritor of Warhol.
Okay, so they have the same parents?
or cousins or the same
Yeah.
gene pool. I think we all are in the same gene pool. I think that we all now live and have lived since I've been born. Thomas and I were born the same year in the 60s.
Which is what year?
64.
Ah.
1964. And I think that the culture we live in, that media culture, began even earlier in the 19th century with photography, something very much a part of the fabric of the history of art within the Parisian context and France in general. And that proliferation of images is something that, he swims in. We all swim in it. But for Desmonts, I think there's a way in which he's slowing down our perception as well. So that the world, because these are not recognizable images to begin with, it's not like you look at that and say, that's where Milosevic gave a speech. Oh, I remember that. And, there's a few things that might be a little more identifiable and some less, depending on if you're German or if you live somewhere else. But there is a sense that he's arresting our viewership by making us look and do a double take, look at the work, and then you see that the paper, there's something about it that even unconsciously, you're not quite sure what you're looking at. And I think that is one of the most crucial aspects of the work. Now, on top of it, he has an architect's sensibility in terms of the idea of the model, making models in the studio, which architects do, but usually architects don't make models on a one-to-one scale, as he does in his studio. They're more like film sets in a sense. But this idea of the model in his work as a concept is crucial. We make models of the world works with models, whether it's thinking about the model of the way in which communications flow, architectural models. We use models to create the world. But we also use models to tell stories in the same sense that a narrative is written in many of these. Many of the pictures have a narrative that you can read into. Some a little less so, some are a little more abstract.
But it's also interesting because, as you said, he came with a mass media context.
Yeah.
And to do all that takes so much time.
Yeah.
So to recreate something makes the process so slow, which is exactly the contrary of our time.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He slows down your perception, which I think is a really good thing. I think
No, but he slows down your perception by doing something which takes so much time.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think that, but the element of time in the work is, I think, a very important thing to think about.
And also what he's creating is something dead. Paper is dead.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word dead.
There's no one in it. No one alive, not even an insect.
There's no people in it.
No animal neither.
No, there's no, but I would make an argument that it is the built environment that we inhabit that's part of what we live in. That's what we live in, and that it's the creation of human intelligence, that you're looking at. You're looking at things that have been designed by people, built by people, sometimes more.
But it's more like a nature morte of 20th century.
I mean, there is a kind of memento mori aspect to it, because the people are ghosts in a sense, but it depends on what image you're looking at. I don't know. I mean, the lack of actual recognizable human form in the work, what you're seeing is the remnants of human form or the results of human activity. But for me, that doesn't make it dead. I don't know. They feel very alive to me.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. It feels like someone has just stepped off stage. I feel like you're in the middle of a story. You're in a part of a film where someone's walked off camera and you're waiting for something else to happen. Matisse is just over there having his cigarette off stage, You don't see the smoke, but I kind of feel like he's there. You kind of feel the warmth of the sun in a work like Clearing, which is it's a recreation of a forest, which is a very non-narrative work in a sense, although it does bring up ideas of the 19th century philosophical sublime and whatnot, but it's more of a moment, a feeling this idea of light coming through a tree. It's more painterly in that sense.
Normally in these museums there's not much mise en scène, but this time there's a lot. Who decided that, him or you?
Oh, it's Thomas. It's very much Thomas. I mean, we work together when we do the scenography. I do the first drawing of a possible layout, and then he and his team kind of look at it and they build a model. And then we kind of, but when it comes to the architecture of the wallpaper and whatnot, that's part of the work. That's another work. It's not simply wallpaper. Thomas designs the wallpaper and uses it in this architectonic way that creates an immersive installation. So.
And why the blossom trees, for example?
Spring came early in Paris this year.
He said so?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. No,
just an idea of poetry?
No, I mean the Hanami wallpaper. He could have done. He has 4, 5, 6, 7 different wallpapers, and the Hanami. For us, made so much sense with the architecture of the building and the glass looking out to the gardens. So this idea of springtime, the idea came from 11th century poem by a female writer in Japan who was a courtesan in one of the courts. And she wrote this text, which is on the label, which I hope you have, which I can't paraphrase precisely, but she basically was describing a cherry blossom tree, which turned out to be an artificial one that people had made. And she felt it was so real.
So, it was concept again.
It was real.
Beauty and concept.
Yes, and then she was just bemoaning the fact that if it rained, it would be destroyed. It was so fragile. This idea of something that was so real to fill, to make her feel like it was real, and then she realized it wasn't real. It was made out of paper, and then she was worried for the fragility of this beauty that would melt in the rain.
Nice. And my last question is about: Did you observe any shift in his work in recent years with the changing society?
I think it's been fairly consistent throughout. I mean, what he in the last number of years added to his practice, which is really important. I forget what year he started doing these, but his daily series. So for years, he had only worked with existing images that he sourced from the media or from books. And at one point, he would walk around with this, living in Los Angeles, and wherever he went, he would take strange, he'd see something funny on his walk in the morning, a dog on a leash attached to a pole, and then took a picture of it without the dog, but just the pole with the leash. And these became his dailies. So it's a very kind of autobiographical process of doing these. And he's been printing them with this very unique and now almost extinct dye transfer process. So they're almost painterly, and they're very strong colors. And they were printed and framed, unlike his large works, which are dissect prints, which are sandwiched between 2 pieces of plexiglass, and they free float without a frame package. They kind of live in the world. They exist as objects in the world. The dailies are more traditionally framed like photographs, but they're smaller in scale too. They're maybe this big, as opposed to being 2.5 meters by 3 meters long. Some of the largest ones, I think the largest one is almost 4 meters wide, the largest historical kind of work. And those dailies are a really critical way of understanding the practice of moving through the world and telling a story about oneself through images. So Joan Didion, very famously at the beginning of her essay, The White Album, the American writer, Californian writer, said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. This idea of narrative and the way in which we create ourselves and create our own identities through narrative, now with Instagram and TikTok and whatnot, with images, not only through stories we tell, but how we tell them visually. This is something that is something Thomas, saw, and in a sense, he started telling his own stories, even if
like anyone, you mean?
Yeah, in a sense, but it's not biographical. It's like I can't go, oh, that's Venice Boulevard in Los Angeles near where he lived, and a coffee shop. There's nothing. There are more of these very droll moments or very strange everyday moments of someone's life. Mail coming through a slot that's been left there because you've been away for 2 weeks and there's a pile of mail, and everything that implies. Things you haven't answered, things that are...
It's a diary?
Diary in a very kind of... it's diaristic in a sense, but it's not comprehensive. So he chooses, he takes many photographs and he chooses a few, but they all imply a narrative. They might mean something to him more than us, but they all imply a very simple narrative. A bar of soap on the edge of a bathtub, cigarettes put out in a modernist white giant ashtray at a hotel. Things like this, a small children's stool with a flower.
So it's kind of poetry of everyday life.
Very much the poetry of everyday life. That's a really beautiful,
probably what
a very beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
Probably what people on TikTok don't do.
On TikTok, probably not. Maybe a little more so on Instagram. I don't know. What do I know?
Merci beaucoup.
You're welcome.